a Roman senator, once warned that as long as one man remained alive, Rome would never truly sleep peacefully. That man had crossed mountains thought impossible to cross. He had annihilated entire Roman armies. He had stood at the edge of Rome itself. And yet, despite coming closer than almost anyone to destroying the Republic, he would spend the final years of his life moving from exile to exile. Hunted by the empire he failed to defeat. His name was Hannibal Barca, and his story is not simply about military genius. It is about obsession, endurance, and the psychological cost of dedicating an entire life to one enemy. Hannibal was born around 247 BC in Carthage. Shortly after the end of the First Punic War, Carthage had lost badly to Rome. The defeat was humiliating. The city had surrendered Sicily, paid massive indemnities, and watched Roman influence expand across the Mediterranean. For the Barcid family, this loss became personal. Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca, was one of Carthage's leading generals, proud, aggressive, deeply hostile toward Rome, according to ancient historians. Before leaving for military campaigns in Iberia, Hamilcar brought his young son to an altar and made him swear eternal hatred toward Rome. Whether the story is perfectly accurate matters less than what it reveals psychologically. Hannibal grew up inside a culture of unfinished defeat. Rome was not merely a rival state, it became an inherited emotional fixation. His identity formed around a conflict older than himself. That environment shaped him profoundly. Unlike Roman aristocrats raised within a stable republic, Hannibal developed inside a society increasingly anxious about survival and prestige. Carthage remained wealthy and influential, but Rome's rise threatened the balance of power permanently. Hannibal learned early that power could disappear. As a child, he accompanied military campaigns in Iberia, modern-day Spain. He grew up among soldiers, negotiations, sieges, and political uncertainty. Warfare was not an abstract concept. It was daily life. He also learned adaptability. The Carthaginian world was multinational and commercially driven. Hannibal became fluent in navigating different cultures, languages, and alliances. This later became one of his greatest strengths. Unlike many Roman commanders, he understood how to work with diverse populations rather than simply dominate them. By his 20s, Hannibal had already developed a reputation for discipline and intelligence. Ancient accounts describe him as physically resilient and emotionally controlled. He could endure exhaustion alongside ordinary soldiers. He shared hardships visibly that mattered enormously in ancient warfare. Armies follow leaders who appear capable of suffering with them. After Hamilcar's death and the later assassination of Hannibal's brother-in-law Hasdrubal, Hannibal assumed command of Carthaginian forces in Iberia around 221 BC. He was only in his mid-20s. Then came the event that would trigger one of history's most famous wars. In 219 BC, Hannibal attacked the city of Saguntum, a Roman-allied settlement south of the Ebro River. Rome demanded accountability. Hannibal refused. War followed. But Hannibal did not choose the obvious strategy, most expected conflict by sea. Instead, Hannibal made a decision that transformed him into legend. He would invade Italy directly by land. The scale of the gamble is difficult to overstate. He marched tens of thousands of troops, cavalry, and war elephants across southern Gaul and over the Alps during winter. Harsh terrain, freezing conditions, tribal attacks, and logistical collapse destroyed much of his army. Many men died before reaching Italy, yet psychologically, the march accomplished something crucial. It created myth. The impossible crossing established Hannibal not just as a commander, but as a force capable of violating assumptions themselves. Rome suddenly faced an enemy who ignored conventional limitations that matters in warfare. Fear is magnified when opponents appear unpredictable once in Italy. Hannibal began a series of victories that shocked the Roman world. At Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, then at Cannae in 216 BC, Cannae became his masterpiece. Using deliberate tactical encirclement, Hannibal trapped and annihilated a massive Roman army. Tens of thousands died in a single day. Some ancient estimates are likely exaggerated, but the scale of destruction was undeniable. Rome had rarely experienced defeat like this. For many observers, it appeared the Republic might collapse entirely. This was Hannibal's peak, and power changed him in subtle ways. Before Italy, Hannibal had been a commander, driven by movement and survival. After Cannae, he became something larger, psychologically. A symbol, a nightmare, inside Roman imagination. Entire generations of Roman children would later hear the warning. Hannibal is at the gates, but symbolic power can distort judgment. After Cannae, many expected Hannibal to march directly on Rome. He did not. Historians still debate whether he truly lacked the siege equipment and manpower necessary, or whether caution and exhaustion shaped the decision. Likely both. What matters is that the war began changing psychologically, from offensive momentum into prolonged endurance. Rome adapted. That was the Republic's greatest strength. Unlike many states in the ancient world, Rome absorbed catastrophic losses without immediate collapse. It rebuilt armies relentlessly. It refused negotiation. It transformed defeat into institutional resilience. This frustrated Hannibal deeply. His victories were tactically brilliant, but strategically incomplete. Italian allies defected more slowly than expected. Carthage failed to provide consistent reinforcements. Hannibal remained isolated, inside hostile territory for years. The environment around him changed gradually. Early in the campaign, Hannibal represented momentum and innovation. Later, he became trapped inside a war of attrition he could not fully control. The same commanders who once feared direct confrontation increasingly avoided him strategically while attacking Carthaginian support networks elsewhere. Rome learned patience. This is a broader historical pattern, repeated across centuries. Exceptional battlefield commanders often struggle when wars shift from decisive engagements into systems of long-term institutional endurance. Napoleon experienced similar dynamics during the Peninsular War and later in Russia. Tactical genius cannot always overcome logistical isolation and political depth. For Hannibal, this shift created psychological strain. He spent over a decade campaigning in Italy, winning battles but failing to force decisive political collapse. Gradually, the image of invincibility began weakening, and isolation affected his judgment. One of the less discussed aspects of Hannibal's later career is how insulated he became from meaningful criticism inside his own command structure. His earlier victories had created enormous loyalty among surviving officers and soldiers. That loyalty was understandable. He had accomplished what many thought impossible, but extraordinary success can narrow perspective. The longer a leader remains undefeated tactically, the harder it becomes for others to challenge assumptions openly. Alternative strategies receive less attention. Doubt becomes associated with disloyalty. Hannibal increasingly relied on the belief that Rome would eventually break psychologically under pressure. But Rome's political culture was built differently. Roman elites often preferred catastrophic sacrifice over negotiated humiliation. In some ways, Hannibal understood warfare better than he understood Roman identity itself. Eventually, Rome shifted the war toward Carthage directly. Under Scipio Africanus, Roman forces invaded North Africa, forcing Hannibal to return home after years abroad. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. This time, Hannibal lost. Scipio adapted many techniques originally learned from studying Hannibal himself. The student defeated the master. The consequences were devastating for Carthage. The city lost territory, military independence, and political leverage permanently. Rome emerged dominant across the Western Mediterranean. For Hannibal, personally, the defeat marked a psychological collapse of purpose. His entire adult identity had revolved around resisting Rome. Now, resistance appeared impossible. Yet Hannibal remained politically active for a time inside Carthage. He attempted administrative reforms and anti-corruption measures, but Rome never stopped fearing his influence. Eventually, pressure forced him into exile. This final phase of his life is revealing. The once feared general moved from court to court across the eastern Mediterranean, seeking protection from Rome's expanding reach. Kings welcomed his expertise cautiously, but Roman influence followed him everywhere. The hunter became hunted. There is something psychologically tragic about leaders whose identities become inseparable from a single lifelong struggle. Once the struggle ends, even survival feels directionless. By the end of his life, Hannibal reportedly carried poison to avoid Roman capture. Around 183 BC, facing imminent arrest, he took his own life. According to ancient accounts, his final words criticized Rome's obsession with pursuing an aging enemy. Whether exact or not, the symbolism is powerful. Rome never truly stopped fearing him. Psychologically, Hannibal's life reveals a man shaped by inherited conflict. He did not simply choose war against Rome, he inherited it emotionally, culturally, and politically before adulthood. His brilliance emerged, partly because he internalized struggles so completely. But obsession has consequences. The same focus that made Hannibal extraordinary also narrowed his world psychologically. Rome became more than an opponent. It became the organizing principle of his existence. History often romanticizes figures like Hannibal because they embody resistance against overwhelming power. But there is another side to that story. Long-term conflict transforms perception. Years of warfare reward emotional suppression. Patience becomes harder. Compromise appears weak. Identity hardens around opposition itself. Over time, individuals stop imagining life outside the struggle they are fighting. Hannibal's greatness was real. His campaigns remain studied in military academies more than 2,000 years later. His adaptability, tactical creativity, and psychological understanding of warfare were exceptional. But history is filled with brilliant individuals who ultimately collide with larger systems, stronger than themselves. That may be the deepest lesson of Hannibal Barca. A single person can disrupt history dramatically. They can terrify empires. They can reshape military thought for centuries. But sustaining victory requires more than genius. It requires institutions, stability, resources, and political endurance. Rome possessed those things. Carthage did not. And in the end, Hannibal's story became something larger than military history. It became a study in the limits of individual brilliance against systems capable of absorbing pain indefinitely. Perhaps that is why his story still feels strangely modern, because every era produces people convinced that intelligence, talent, or willpower alone can overcome structural reality. Sometimes they succeed temporarily. Occasionally, they even appear unstoppable, until they encounter systems designed not to win quickly, but simply to survive longer. Hannibal crossed mountains that should not have been crossed. He defeated armies larger than his own. He forced Rome into fear few enemies ever achieved. And yet, the empire he nearly destroyed ultimately outlived him by centuries. In the end, Hannibal Barca discovered something history repeats relentlessly. Victory in battle and victory in history are not always the same thing.